Good afternoon, welcome to the Rotary Club of LaGrange on Wednesday, February 1st, 2023. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by dedication, beginning by Margaret Henry. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please join me as we pray. Dear Heavenly Father, as our sons and daughters celebrate their graduations, please be with them to guide and protect them as they prepare for the next phase of their responsibilities and adventures. We pray that you watch over all of our children to protect them and give them the strength to make their best decisions as we continue to strive to be the positive role models they so need. We ask for your blessings today for us and all Rotarians who, through our thoughts, words, and deeds, continue to work together to create a more peaceful existence for all. We ask this in your Son's holy name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Barbara. Council comments.
Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce our guests. Please stand when your name is called, and stand until all names have been called. Our first guest is Zachary Taylor, guest of Pink Miles. Our next guest is Steve Jeffries, guest of Wilson. And then we'll have Randy Nix come up and introduce his guests. So welcome.
I won't come up, but I want to introduce my guest. This is Chris Campbell. Chris, yes, stand up. Chris's father is Joe Campbell, who is the state representative from down at Milledgeville, a great guy that I've got to know. He called me a couple of weeks ago and said Chris was coming to me and work with you, man. I asked if I could help him meet some good folks. And it's kind of a look in the mirror. About 30 years ago, I was in that position. I had just moved to LaGrange, and Robert Morton brought me to Rotary and said, here, meet these folks. So meet Chris Campbell. I hope y'all get to know him. I'm sure he's a good guy, knowing his father. So I'm glad to have him with us.
Thank you. Welcome, guests. We have some birthdays today, this week. Boris Jones was yesterday, Sandy Lee on Friday, and Jerry Fox on Saturday. Big announcement, of course, is do not forget the annual banquet, Thursday night, June 15th. You need to RSVP with Barbara, and she is here today, so you need to let her know. It's at Hills and Dells, so you know it's gonna be great. It's Carlton is planning with a long trip, so you know it's gonna be a wonderful evening with music and good food from, I'm not gonna tell you. I'm gonna tell you, you'll have to wait and see. It's gonna be great. We do have a few minutes for happy dollars, if anybody has $1 and is happy. Anybody have $1, just kind of so-so?
So we're approaching the end of the Rotary year, and I think it'd be appropriate for us to recognize and thank Ken for his year of service. He's just been so consistent and kept things light, and we've had great programs and fellowship, and I just, as I'm getting into that role, I'm realizing it's a big sacrifice, a lot of time. And in addition to just making sure it's there every single week. So I want to thank and recognize him.
Good to see you out this happy holiday on behalf of Memorial Day, which we celebrated on Monday, and we celebrated in the city of Hogansville. And we thank all our veterans, people with veterans that are here, and those that make the ultimate sacrifice. So it's that.
Great, thank you so much. And speaking of great programs, I'm going to have Ted come up and introduce ours today.
Well, this is the fourth time that I've had the privilege of introducing Michael Chris to the LaGrange Rotary Club. His previous presentations have been very well received, and I don't intend to use up Mike's time with a lengthy introduction. Mike is a native of Cleveland, Ohio, and a graduate Miami University in Ohio. He's the Vice President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta and serves in the Corporate Engagement Division. His work with the Atlanta Fed started almost 34 years ago. And today, his role is to serve as the lead public information officer for the 6th District Federal Reserve. His work takes him all over the 6th District to teach citizens about the Federal Reserve, as well as to learn how their economies perform, so that he can take back that information to the bank's senior leaders. When Mike was invited to speak today, 3 large banks have not had deposit runs that led to their failure. I'm sure that there will be some time for questions on the Federal Reserve's complicated role of managing monetary policy in a time of fiscal policy excellence. Please extend a warm Rotary welcome to Mike Chris.
In 4 times, usually I only get invited back so people can tell me how wrong I've been about things I've said in previous visits. So there is opportunity for Q&A, and anybody that wants to call me on anything that I've said in the past at the end. I'm certainly not going to speak for, what did Ted say, we had till 3 o'clock, right? I do want to go through a couple of pictures about what's happening in the economy today, and end with some thoughts about where things seem to be going. But I do want to start with, well, let me say this first. What I'm doing today is part of my job. It's this new initiative that, coming out of the pandemic, we really hadn't been in weaving the Federal Reserve, hadn't been anywhere for a couple of years. We hadn't been out in the community. The speeches that we were making, and the visits that President Bostic was making, were online. And so as head of our public affairs department, I knew how important it was to get back out there. And so we started to plan. I had one of my staff members do a map of the Southeast and where we've been, and more importantly, where we hadn't been over the last 5 or 6 years. And we had been to the big cities, Nashville, Orlando, Miami, no problem. But there were serious gaps in that map that we weren't going to smaller towns and rural areas. And so the initiative that I'm leading now focuses on getting to those communities. And there's a picture of a couple of places that I've been over the past 6 to 8 months, 8 months now. And I also love to come to Rotary clubs. That's always the social clubs, civic groups, because in my experience, I've not been at this for a while, what is said at Rotary stays at Rotary. And nobody is shy about sharing their opinion. Nobody holds back if they disagree with something that I'm saying. And that's how we learn about what's happening at the local economy, what people are thinking, if they run a business, whether they're planning. All that's really important information that we use to develop our view on how the economy is performing. And if you think about why that is so important, it's really because of these two guys. Now, I'm sure everybody knows who that is. I'm not going to ask it. Well, does anybody not know? I'm about to say, does anybody not know? Like, no. Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton. So when our country was founded, there was a great debate that happened between these two about what kind of financial system our country should have. And of course, Hamilton wanted a centralized system with the central bank, just like other major countries had at the time. Jefferson's view was, we just fought a war to get rid of that. Why would we want to put that on ourselves? They had that, again, a great debate. If you've seen the musical Hamilton, they get it right, what the issue was. And Hamilton's view went out. So the central bank was created, but it was only created with a 20-year charter. And at the end of that 20 years, the Jefferson view was predominant in Congress and the charter wasn't renewed. Now we had the War of 1812, and our country's finances were in shambles again. That debate, but not between these two at the time, but that same debate about what kind of financial system should we have? Should we have a strong centralized financial system or one that's more spread out, more diverse? They gave the Hamiltonian view a second chance, but again, it only proved with the 20-year charter, like the first one. So in 1836, who was president in 1836? Anybody know? Jackson. You know anything about Andrew Jackson? Not a big fan of centralized authority. And as a matter of fact, it was called the Second Bank of the United States, was our second attempt at having a central bank. He called it a den of vipers and thieves. So you can imagine that when that legislation came up, it wasn't renewed. So for the rest of the century, we didn't have a central bank. Fast forward to the early 1900s, we're having one financial crisis after another. Our financial system really wasn't keeping up with the growth of our economy, and that debate occurred again. And this time, I think they got it right because it was a compromise between both views. And that compromise is what the Federal Reserve System is today. You do have a strong central authority, that's the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C., but you also have representations from around the country, which is the Reserve Bank, so the Federal Reserve Bank. And importantly, it was set up to be independent from political pressure because the decisions that the Federal Reserve makes are oftentimes not very popular. But with that, I'll call it power that we have that's been given to us by Congress, comes a responsibility to be present, to be transparent, to be accountable, to be out in our community. So I'm here today because of these guys. As far as our talk on the economy goes, I'd like to start with kind of overall what's happening in the economy, overall economic activity. Of course, focus on the Fed's two jobs. We call it our dual mandate to keep inflation low and stable and to foster conditions that maximize employment. We'll get into that in a second. And then talk about what the Fed's policy response has been to challenges that we've had coming out of the pandemic, focusing on the high level of inflation. and then end with talking about what are some risks to the outlook that we're seeing. So if you think about what's happening in the overall economy, the biggest part of our economy is consumer spending, right? It's kind of about 2/3 of our overall economy is the things that we spend money on, the things that businesses spend money on. And we're seeing some signs that that's starting to slow down a little bit. Now the economy is growing. We're not in a recession. We haven't been in a recession. And the growth rate is still positive. It was just around 3% in the last quarter. So that's pretty strong for an economy that, at this point, we're going to talk about the Federal Reserve's response to high inflation. But we've done a lot to slow the economy down. But retail sales and the consumer are doing pretty well. There's strength there. Part of the issue is, I call it an issue because I'm talking like I work for the Fed. Like it's a problem that the economy is growing stronger, that things look good. It's not in that overall sense, but it is when you're trying to bring inflation down. So we had a retail sales report that has come out since I put this chart together, and it surprised on the upside. It was stronger than we expected. And we were thinking that coming out of the pandemic, the money that people had in their pockets that they either didn't spend during the pandemic or they had because of fiscal policy decisions like stimulus checks. My kids call them stimmies. I don't know if your kids, what they did with their checks or what everybody did with their. I told them to put it in the bank if they did, if they spent it. I tried, but it's okay. They spent some of their stuff on things for me, so I guess that's all right. But we were thinking that spending was running out of steam. But overall, it's retail sales have been strong. They're slowing down a little bit, but still positive. Consumer confidence is showing some signs. It's a chart on the right-hand side, showing some signs of easing. It's a survey that comes out of the University of Michigan, very useful data point. Ted mentioned from Ohio, so I can't say anything good about the University of Michigan. I have to put the Buckeye sign up here. It's a great survey. It's a great university. I got a problem with football. But anyway, so we're seeing the consumer start to slow down. And this chart is a tool that we have at the Atlanta Fed. It's called GDP Now. It's basically a running estimate of economic growth for the current quarter. Because if you think about it, we're not going to know what economic growth, the official data point for economic growth for the second quarter is until July, the end of July, which doesn't make a lot of sense. It takes a month after the end of the quarter for all that data to come in. What we've done at the Atlanta Fed is built like I had anything to do with it. People a lot smarter than me did this. But it takes the data that's coming in and puts it into a model that estimates what economic growth is at that time in the quarter. So it's kind of a running estimate of where the economy is. And we're doing okay for the estimate for the second quarter. So overall, economic growth is strong. Consumers are showing signs of still spending, still being strong. It's not just the extra money that they've had from the pandemic, but when labor markets are as strong as they are, people are working or spending. And the fact that we've raised interest rates through the Federal Reserve from around 0 to 5% in just a little more than a year hasn't really had a large enough impact on the consumer to get them to really hunker down. So economic growth is still very strong. So inflation. The Fed's job is to keep inflation low and stable. Inflation is not low, it's stabilized from where it was. It's starting to slow down a little bit, it's starting to come down. But we have an official target of inflation growing at 2% on a yearly basis. We're well over that 2%. Inflation rose for a number of reasons related to the pandemic. Basically, it was a mismatch between supply and demand. And we all had basic business and economics courses. Whenever you have more demand than supply, prices are going to go up. And that's exactly what happened. There was also the pandemic response policies, both on the fiscal side, with all the programs that were put in place to make sure the economy didn't crash. And also from the monetary policy side, when we brought interest rates back to zero to keep the economy going during the pandemic. There was also supply chain disruptions that really caused bottlenecks in the whole manufacturing and production process that raised the price of a lot of goods and filtered through to raising prices in the number of services. I mentioned that inflation is high, but it's starting to slow down a little bit. This is the rate that the Federal Open Market Committee uses, which is the policymaking body of the Federal Reserve. It's nowhere near 2%. It's not declining very rapidly. So I think the view is that it's going to be a long process to get back to 2%. But the positive sign is that we don't continue to grow. So keeping inflation low and stable, the Fed still has quite a bit of work to do. On the positive side, inflation expectations, which are incredibly important because they're basically what businesses are telling us they expect inflation to be a year from now. And you can see the big run up to close to almost 4%. But as soon as the Fed started to raise interest rates and we started to say we're going to get inflation back down to 2%, that number started to come down. It hasn't been down to 2%, but the fact that inflation expectations aren't continuing to rise tells us that businesses believe that we're going to get back to 2%. And I think if you listen to what Chairman Powell has said and what my boss, Raphael Bostic, has said about how fast it's going to be to get to 2%, it's going to be a while. It's going to take some time to get back to that level. What that ends up looking like is, I'll show a forecast chart in a little bit, but at least a couple more years is the expectation now it's going to take for that year-over-year percent change in inflation to get back to 2%. So that's one part of the Fed's job, keep inflation low and stable. Also, before I go on, there's a couple things in the front. One is just a little pamphlet that tells you how to access information from the Atlanta Fed. It's all free. We want people to keep up with what we're doing. And there's also some information about that the survey that I'm showing a picture of. I want representation from across the Southeast to participate in our survey, not just big businesses from big towns, but also businesses from smaller communities and mid-sized cities like LaGrange. So if you're interested, grab a pamphlet on the way out. So the second part of our mandate is to try to create conditions in the economy to maximize employment. The bars in this chart represent the monthly growth rate and overall jobs for the economy. It's averaged out, it's a 12-month moving average, so you can kind of see what the trend is. And the line is the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate hasn't been this low in close to 4 years. We're seeing some deceleration in the pace of job growth in the country, but still incredibly strong, over 300,000 jobs a month being added. So from the employment side of our mandate, the labor market is very strong. In fact, it's a little bit too strong, if I can use that phrase. Not in a negative sense, but there's that mismatch between supply and demand that I talked about with good prices coming out of the pandemic. We're seeing that mismatch in labor markets as well. Demand for labor is still outstripping the available supply. That gap is starting to narrow a little bit, but this is what part of the inflation problem is. And again, I apologize for how I phrase this because I don't think people getting raises is a bad thing. But what can happen is businesses have to pay their workers more, and to make up for that, they have to raise prices of the goods and services that they provide. And inflation can result because of that. So we're seeing not just tightness in supply of goods coming out of the pandemic because of supply chain disruptions, but also tightness in labor markets because the economy recovered a lot faster than I think we thought, and businesses are having trouble still to this day finding workers for open positions. That's not a picture of me at home. But, the idea that's out there that I hear quite a bit is, people just need to get back to work. They're living off the government dole, they're taking it easy. Look, there's always been people that do, let's be honest, right? And what stays in Rotary, what says in Rotary stays in Rotary, right? So nobody's reporting, well, shoot, I didn't think about that. But anyways, there's always been people that take advantage of the system. But what we found, and not just we at the LFN, but other researchers, have found is people are actually making some pretty sound decisions based on their current economic situation as to why they're not currently in the labor force. An example is parents having trouble getting daycare because there was a pandemic resulted in a lot of daycares closing down. And if they can't find daycare, it's pretty far away, it's expensive, so it makes more sense for one of the parents, usually the mom, to stay home. It makes economic sense. Another thing that we're getting more involved with in consulting with state and local governments is something called the benefits cliff. So people that are receiving benefits from the government because they're below the poverty line or are currently struggling in their lives, that are currently employed, they have jobs, and they have the opportunity to get a better job, or to get a raise, or go back to school and get more credentials, and then get more money, shying away from that because the income level, their income would get to a level that would result in them not getting as many benefits as they are getting. And so that transition from a job that's, you're getting along okay with it, but you're getting along okay because you're also getting some assistance from the government. People are deciding not to take better jobs because if you add up that little raise, it's gonna make me lose benefits. It just makes more economic sense for them in that moment not to take that job. And so trying to adjust how that benefit cliff works to encourage people to either take better jobs or to get back into the labor force is something that a lot of elected officials are struggling with. So we talked about where have all the workers gone. Starting with the chart from the right, the prime age labor force, which is ages 25 to 54, which kind of bothers me a little bit since I'm not in that. I hate to admit that I'm not in my prime anymore. There's no one of those economic phrases that drives me bad. But we're back to where we were for the majority of that big section of the labor force, pre-pandemic to now. So that participation rate is back to where it was. It doesn't mean that gap is totally closed because had it been not for the pandemic, that participation rate might be higher, but we at least achieved parity as to where we were. The folks that are still out of the labor market are out for a number of reasons. I mentioned family responsibilities in the example that I gave. That's the green part of that chart. There's also something called the shadow labor force. I have a friend of mine that's an economist in Middle Georgia, uses the phrase people in side hustles. So they're not like working for a company, but they're working and they're getting paid. It's just kind of underneath, it's not on books. So they're out there doing stuff, but it's not for a company and it's not getting captured in the data that the Department of Labor puts together. There's also been a number of early retirements that people that are well before the normal age of retiring coming out of the pandemic, they're just thinking, I've got decent savings, my spouse is still working, I'm done. I want to do something else. And so we're seeing some of those early retirements have an impact as well. So we're getting back to normalization with regard to the labor force, but what the new normal is post-pandemic, we're talking about this at the table over lunch. There's going to be a lot of PhDs in economics written on what's happening in the labor market today and what it's going to look like tomorrow. And I know I'm going to get a question about AI. We talked about it a little bit at the table. No clue how that's going to affect it. But these technology developments that are having an impact on labor force, those are going to continue. And how all this kind of settles out in the long run is something I think, like I said, a lot of folks are thinking about. So the Federal Reserve's response to all of these developments, focusing on the jobs that we have, keep inflation low and stable, that 2% target. As a quote from my boss from a couple months ago, basically saying, look, you better believe us when we tell you we're getting back to 2%. Because that's the goal, that's our job, and we're going to get there. At the last meeting in May, they raised interest rates again, but they also signaled that they're going to pause and see what the long-term impact, or what the impact of those raises to date look like. Monetary policy changes and changes in interest rate takes time to filter through the economy. Some sectors are hit pretty rapidly. Think of like the housing sector, mortgage rates go up immediately, has an impact. But other sectors, it takes some time for that impact to be really fully felt. So we don't want to be on automatic pilot, just continuing to raise interest rates because we're not at 2%. The idea is let's take our time, make sure we're not doing undue damage to the economy, but we think we have some more room to raise interest rates further down the road if we need to, because that strong labor market, the economy is still growing. We don't think we're going to crash the economy if we raise interest rates a little bit more. So I think the debate going forward at the FOMC meetings that my boss is going to participate in 2 weeks from now, the next one, is going to be really interesting, because I think you're going to hear some voices that say, look, we shouldn't pause. We need to start to do more. Just have his face like, what? We're not going to pause? I don't know. I'm not making a prediction what they're going to have, but I can't speak for my boss there. But the last inflation report that came out was higher than expected. The last retail sales report that came out was higher than expected. So, and my boss is on record. He said, look, you know, if you were to ask me today what the chances are of us, we're at a certain level now, at 5 to 5.25%. If you were to ask me if the next move is up or down, he thinks the next move would be up if we had to, not necessarily down. And I know there's some market pundits out there that think that, you know, the Fed's going to start to lower interest rates by the end of this year. I can't think of a scenario other than something awful happening in the economy that would lead to that kind of conclusion. So I'm not quite there yet. This is a picture of my puppy. Because when I tell you what the outlook is, I want you not to remember how wrong I was, but rather what a cute dog I am. But this is, as of now, the official Fed forecast. This is available on the Board of Governors website. And if you look at for the unemployment rate for 2023, you know, we're at 3.4% now. The expectation is that, and again, this forecast was made in May, that the economy would slow significantly to a point where the unemployment would rise to 4.5%. And also things would slow significantly enough that the inflation rate would get down from close to between 4.5%, 5%, depending on what measure you're looking at, to 3.25% by the fourth quarter. I don't think I'm going too far out on the limb when I say next forecast that comes out, but this was done in March, not May, I'm sorry. They do it every other meeting. The next forecast will come out at the next meeting, which is in a couple of weeks. I don't think I'm going to go too far on the limb to say these forecasts are going to change. That the unemployment rate expectation is probably going to be a little bit lower than 4.5%, and the inflation rate expectation is probably going to be a little bit higher than 30%. It's going to take a while to bring inflation back down, and labor markets are still very, very strong. What are some risks to the forecast? The biggest risk, of course, I think I've said inflation 20 times, but that inflation is stickier than we think it is, stickier than we already think it's stickier than it should be based on how much the Fed has done to slow things down. But the biggest risk is that inflation stays high and that the Fed has to act even more than it already has to bring inflation back down, because that could have a negative impact on overall economic growth. The other one is the banking sector. Ted mentioned when we first talked, I think it was the first week of March or way back when. The Silicon Valley Bank thing hadn't happened, and other issues in the banking sector hadn't happened. What we're seeing is that we're not seeing any indication, this isn't 2007, 2008. When we talk to banks, we haven't seen any run on our deposits, especially in the Southeast. So that kind of leads us to believe that the situation was unique to those institutions out west. That doesn't mean that banks aren't under pressure because of the interest rate increases that the Fed has undertaken to slow things down. And I don't think it's crazy to think that credit conditions can tighten further than they already have. And that could have an impact of slowing the economy down as well. And lastly, hopefully we can put this one to bed. I think Ted just said that they're voting on it tonight, the deal that they struck. So hopefully tonight I can take this one off the list, because defaulting on our debt is a scary thing, and I don't think anybody wants to go there. That's currently a risk. So I will stop there with yet another plug to follow the Fed. You know, we're your Federal Reserve. We're here to represent, you know, your views on how the economy. Part of the reason, like I said, I'm here is not just to explain what the Fed is and where we see the economy going, but to hear how you think the economy at LaGrange is doing. And the information that we have is all free. You know, like I said at the beginning, you know, the Fed is a really powerful and is an influential institution. The decisions that are made affect the Federal Reserve, affect all of our lives. And in a democracy like we have, I think it's important that the people know what we're up to. And we're trying to be as transparent and accountable as we can be. So follow us if you have time. You get one email a week. I know people hate to get emails and we split into your inbox, but one email a week tell you everything that's been happening at the event over the past week, updates on our data products. President Bostic is giving a talk. He'll tell you what he said. So it's just a great way to keep up with what's happening at your local Federal Reserve. So with that, I'll stop, entertain any questions that you have until we have till 3 o'clock. Just kidding. All right, help me out. Who's first? Yeah, take care.
All right, so there are some economists who think that in the next decade, we're going to have some pretty good economic growth because of all the reshoring. So we'll have, we won't have that overseas cheap labor like we've had in the past, but we'll have better high-paying jobs, but all that is going to be inflationary. And if that's the case, if we have, higher growth, but higher inflation because of the higher-paying jobs, would the Fed, potentially adjust that 2% target, or is that something you think we're going to always stick to the 2%?
That's a great question. The onshoring thing, I'm not convinced it's going to automatically lead to higher pressure, higher inflationary pressure, because typically productivity increases kind of make up for that. These are weird times based on, like I said, what's going on in labor markets and the like. So how that's, the productivity numbers haven't been all that great. So I think that, to that point, I don't see it as a one-to-one. Would the Fed ever change its target from 2% to something else? Not voluntarily. Because basically we'd be saying, okay, we're going to go from 2% to 3%. Well, what's going to keep us from going to 3% to 5% down the road if things get tough? I don't see that happening, because it basically take any credibility that we have and throw it right in the trash can. But like I said, so we're not going to do it voluntarily. But great question. I lost track of who's first. Yeah, you guys fight it out.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to revisit the slide you had around the around the banking industry. I guess the thought that pops in my head is that, I don't have the exact numbers, but our bank concentration is something around 40%, which means like the top 3 or 4 banks have about 40% of the assets in the about 40% of the assets. So you have that. So you have a lot of concentration. These banks have taken a lot of hits with their commercial real estate portfolios, especially coming out of the pandemic. People just aren't going to office buildings anymore, and various reasons. But you have hits on commercial, massive hits on commercial real estate portfolios in a concentrated industry. So that's kind of out there. My question is, how do you guys think about those types of issues, and especially when these banks have to go, when the banks borrow money from the Fed at a discount rate, that obviously gets paid back to the customers, pay that back. The everyday customer pays that back. So I guess where I'm going with this is, the question I have is, with bank concentration, failing commercial real estate portfolios, increases in discount rate, how do you guys factor that into your decision making on what to raise or lower?
So, yeah, I mean, it's a great question. You hit all the nails on the head with regard to the financial sector, except the shadow financial system, which is spooky. Commercial real estate is definitely out there. The institutions that, and I don't have any insight into which bank has which, that's all behind the firewall, I don't get to see that. But clearly, industry-wise, it's an issue for the exact reason that you said. There are what's called systemically important institutions, the big banks that have, which, by the way, I hate that saying. It makes it feel like if you're a financial institution that's not like that, then you're not important. We've got to come up with a better phrase than that. But basically, those institutions the whole system as a whole is well capitalized right now. And I kind of feel like I'm one of those policemen that says, oh, it's okay, nothing to see here. But yeah, you're absolutely right. When there is interest rate risk out there, there's risk with portfolio imbalances for institutions that are heavy into commercial. But we don't see those factors adding up to a systemic level that would have a significant impact on the overall health of the economy. That said, we learned in 2007, when these things happen, they can happen quickly for unforeseen reasons. So I know at our institution, it's something that my colleagues that work in our supervision and regulation department are paying a heck of a lot more attention to than they were 6 months ago. But it hasn't had an impact on our forecasts. The way that it filters into how we think about where the economy is headed down the road, I think Jerome Powell put it really well. And I kind of referred to it a little bit, in that it's reasonable to expect that credit conditions will tighten. So as credit conditions tighten, it becomes harder, more expensive to get a loan, it becomes more difficult to be qualified for a loan. That has the effect of slowing down the economy too. But we don't see a systemic issue in the financial sector at this point.
Thank you.
In your 3-year forecast, did you factor in the rate increase in that to bring the
Yes.
inflation down?
Yeah, that's all. So what that forecast is, it's an average of the 19 people who have a say in monetary policy. It's the 12 Reserve Bank presidents and the 7 members of the Board of Governors. It's an average of what their forecasts are. And as part of that forecast, they call what they say, what is your expectation under appropriate monetary policy conditions, meaning that interest rates would be at in their mind, what the most appropriate level would be. So that does factor into what they're on.
Can you tell us how many increases are in the projection?
It's different for every, and there's something called, I don't have a picture of it, but there's something that gets released every other meeting. It's called, it's got a stupid name like everything else at the Fed. It's called the dot plot. And it shows 19 dots on a plot that says that every dot represents either a president, it doesn't identify who's who. But it says, okay, at the end of 2013, where do you expect interest rates to be? And it'll have a dot there. So you can see where everybody is. And going forward, you can kind of tell where those dots kind of 3 years from now, they kind of average out right around a little bit lower than we are now. So some people think we're going higher than we are now. When I say people, I mean people that actually have a say in this, not me and my buddies down at the bank, but President Bostic and his colleagues. Some of them think that we might have to raise interest rates further. Some of them think that we're okay for a while. And then as time goes on, inflation comes back down. You get that long-term, interest rate that makes most sense for an inflation rate at like 2%. And for most of them, it's right around 4.5%, 3 years out. No, you, and then sort of that. And I think that's
Yeah, I realize you're giving like a 30,000 foot kind of view, and it's hard to get into deep specifics with so many different categories of inflation, because you can have inflation with cars that can be very different from inflation with building materials, food, and the different reasons for each one, and why some are so much higher than others. Because when you see the general statistics, you know, sometimes people don't feel that. Like I have a friend that's an ophthalmologist, and he was gonna build a surgery center, or he actually has built a surgery center. But when he was agreeing to contract with the construction company, he was like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna build. But when they actually started building a year and a half later, his inflation feeling was nothing, with all due respect, his costs were at least double than what he originally agreed upon to build a surgery center. So you get into whatever building materials are related to that building, you know, but the question is, in these specific areas where you've had really high spikes of inflation, like what are specific solutions when it comes to why is there such a shortage? Like, because when you have building material that they can't get, like what are the solutions to actually increase the ability in the supply chain, whether it's coming from another country or whatever's creating that spike that's a little bit manufactured, no pun intended. It's because the material's there, but we're just not getting it into our borders, or there's a process that's creating a shortage that you would think there would be a solution to.
Right.
So how do you change scenarios where there should be enough supply, but we're feeling a pinch, whether it's car batteries that are coming from China or whatever it may be?
So first of all, it's a great question and a reminder to me that when I say inflation, it's like this particular measure is the broadest measure of all prices that we have in the economy. And it's a good reminder to me that not everybody feels all the prices in the economy, so thank you for that. As far as the best response that I can come up with is first of all, the Fed doesn't make stuff, so we can't, the Fed doesn't have the tools to affect the price of the goods that end in a construction. The solution is the market economy finds a way, and I kind of get a little bit jittery at thinking of it in any other way. So I'd rather let markets figure out what the price is, and when there's bottlenecks, companies that are going to step in and figure out how to fix that. I mean, that's what, in our system, that capitalist system, that's how it works. Where it gets tricky is when you have food and energy prices, especially, because people have to eat and they have to get places. And so you see some intervention in those areas. So if prices spike in a certain area, if you don't have money to pay for something, there's potential public policy solutions to that. But businesses are smart. They've adapted. They figured things out. And a lot of them are, to take your story and to kind of broaden it out a little bit. We've heard similar things from businesses that said, look, I was going to do this, but the prices went up. And so I'm not doing it now. I'm going to wait. And then as prices come down, both not in terms of, not just for goods, but also the services, because construction employment is, there's a bottleneck there too. They're going to wait until it makes sense for them economically to do it. So I think businesses make decisions on what to proceed with and when. And also companies that provide the goods and services figure out a way to make that happen over time. And a lot of those disruptions just take time to work out. We had another question, but I think we're
You guys are
on.
coming back. Go ahead.
We can talk afterwards.
Yeah, he'll stay on for a minute. So.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right, thanks,
Sure.
The trip is right.
We've been having a great every week, speakers coming down to grace us with their presence. We sure appreciate you being here today. And in honor of your speaker, we'll be making a donation to Polio Plus, which is Rotary's initiative to eradicate polio worldwide. Thank you again so much for being here. Next week, Jim Thornton, and then next week we will not be here because that is banquet week, Thursday night, and you need to get your RSVP to Barbara. Thank you for being here. We're adjourned.